there is need to share more, both with opposition, sometimes confidentially, and with the public at large. And what has been done so far in case of Chinese transgressions in eastern Ladakh, I believe, falls short of that.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Has the Foreign Minister's statement on China last week in Parliament left several core questions unanswered? And does that suggest that despite claims to the contrary, we haven't gone back to the status quo of April 2020? And in turn, does that raise the question, have the Indian people been told the full truth about the recent agreement with China to disengage in Ladakh? Those are the three key issues I shall explore today with India's former ambassador to China and presently director of the Institute of Chinese Studies, Ashok Kantha. Mr. Kantha, in an article you wrote for The Hindu on Monday, you said the foreign minister's statement in Parliament on the 3rd of December leaves several core questions unanswered. I want to raise several of those questions with you one by one. First, after noting that the resumption of patrolling to the traditional areas is underway, you ask whether patrols can access 5 traditional patrolling points beyond Y Junction in Depsang and Charding Nala in Demchok. Do you fear they can't? And if that is the case, what would it mean?
Well, Karan, first of all, let me make it clear that minister's statement, as I put it in my Hindu article, did shed fresh light on some of the issues under discussion with China. There is greater clarity on some issues, but there are a whole lot of other areas where we seek more visibility, more transparency. Coming specifically to a question you posed about resumption of patrolling in Depsang Plains and resumption of both patrolling and grazing in Demchok area. Minister did mention that resumption of patrolling to traditional patrolling points in Depsang Plains is underway. Presumably, it will be achieved. We would like to have greater clarity. For instance, there is a place what we call Y Junction or bottleneck. Beyond that, our patrols used to go to 5 patrolling points. Will they get full unhindered access to those patrolling points? Likewise, how far on our side of the LAC will the Chinese be allowed to come? They would like to move as close to Butse as possible. We don't have any inkling, any visibility on what has been agreed in terms of patrolling by Chinese side. Coming to Demchok area, in fact, we don't know at all whether Indian troops will be allowed to go back to, there's a junction between Charding Nala and Nilung Nala, what is called CNN junction, or there's a pass called Chardingla, which is rather difficult to access, but our patrols used to go there earlier. Will they be allowed to return to those places? Likewise, there were grazing grounds in that area where our nomads, our graziers were going. Will they get access to all those grazing grounds? These issues remain unclear, but if you permit me, Karan, to be fair, I should give background on this issue. There's always been a debate how far you can reveal in public domain about issues which are sensitive nature, which are under discussion with China. When we were discussing agreements on confidence building measure with China and subsequently agreement on political parameters guiding principle boundary settlement with China, their inclination was not to make these agreements public, but we insisted that given the nature of society we have to make them public, and we did make them public. Likewise, for instance, during discussions on the Wangtung incident, 1986-87, our government made a whole lot of statements in Parliament. This time around, that transparency is missing. In fact, External Affairs Minister's statement in Lok Sabha on 3rd November and Rajya Sabha on 4th November were the first substantive statement to come out from Ministry of External Affairs since transgression started sometime around May 2020. So it took us for more than 4.5 years to give details, and still, as I mentioned, many vital details are missing. So, how to balance these two
Can I
conflicting
sum up what you're
Yeah.
saying for the audience? Because you've made two very important points. First, you've said that we lack visibility, to use your phrase, we lack clarity about whether the patrolling at Depsang will cover the 5 traditional patrolling points that we earlier were able to access. And secondly, whether we can cover the grazing grounds and the earlier bits that we would patrol at Demchok. Secondly, beyond the visibility and lack of clarity, you're also saying that unlike in the past when details were given and agreements were made public, this time that hasn't happened.
Well, when it comes to agreements on disengagement, they're not necessarily made public. Let's be fair on that.
But you think they should be in this instance?
No, I think more details need to be given. Number one. Number two, my own preference when I was negotiator for two situations where we arrived at disengagement, Wangtung in 1995 and Demchok and Chumar in 2014. We instead insisted on written understandings, written agreements. This time around, the impression we get is that there's no written agreement. In fact, Chinese have very deliberately refrained from using the term agreement at all in their pronouncements. Whereas in our statements, including EMEA readout on latest WMCC meeting, we are using the term agreement. So this kind of divergence can be avoided if we
Well,
have.
it can be more than avoided. This sort of divergence is troubling. But let me ask you specifically, if it turns out that behind the lack of clarity, we cannot access the 5 traditional patrolling points at Depsang, we cannot go to the point you think we ought to go to where we did go in the past in Demchok, what would it mean? What would it mean if it turns out that we can't access those areas?
Well, Karan, I'm reasonably certain that we will be able to access 5 patrolling points in Depsang Plains. What I'm less certain about is what will be nature of that patrolling, because while minister's statement in Parliament doesn't refer to coordinated patrolling, other background briefings have referred to this term. Now, what does it will it involve restrictions on patrolling by us, on size of patrol or frequency of patrol? Will they be coordinated and prior consultation? And more important, as I mentioned earlier, what kind of access are we giving to the Chinese side? On our side of the line?
You're saying now something very important. You're saying you believe or you hope. I'm not sure which of the two. You believe or you hope that we will get access to the 5 traditional patrolling points, but because you raised that question, you're not sure at the moment that we will have access. And I'm simply asking you this. Suppose we don't have access, what would it mean?
No, but I don't want to speculate on that. In fact,
Why?
I'll
You
no, I'll
raised
be
the question. Why won't you
no,
speculate?
no, no. I'll be most reluctant to speculate because minister has mentioned that process is underway for patrolling, resumption patrolling to traditional patrolling points. Presumably, this will involve 5 patrolling points beyond Y Junction. That's my understanding.
All
But
right.
we'd like to have better clarity.
We're in a very interesting situation where you raise the doubt yourself in your article whether we have access to those 5 traditional patrolling points beyond Y Junction in Depsang and whether we have access to the patrolling points we always reached in Demchok. But having raised that question, you don't want to speculate about what it would mean if we don't have access. I can understand your reluctance because you have been a government servant, but I'm just pointing out for the audience that in your article you raise that question. I'm simply echoing that question back to
Uh,
you, and you now don't want to speculate, but
In
that's no
in
problem.
fact, Karan, if I may add, in my article, I also mentioned that we can only speculate at this point in time in absence of hard facts.
Absolutely. We can only
So
speculate
there,
whether
there
we
is
have
there is
access.
absence of
We can only
yes,
speculate whether we have
yeah.
access, and clearly that means we aren't sure whether we have access. We hope we do. We would like to have access, but we can't simply be sure. And the second point you make is that this term, which you say the minister didn't use, but other officials have used, coordinated patrolling, could suggest that there are restrictions on the size and the frequency of India's patrols. Now, let me ask you about that. If there are such restrictions, would that be a matter of concern?
Well, Karan, coordinated patrolling is a new term, a new concept in lexicon of India-China border negotiations. So we are not quite clear about connotation of this phrase, coordinated patrolling. From what we have heard from various people, there will be restrictions on size of patrols, as also on frequency of these patrols.
Why is that
And this
worrying?
apply to both sides.
Why is that worrying?
It's a worrying because, it sort of changes facts on the ground. What is our objective? If you ask me, our objective in this whole exercise should be to ensure that as a result of their military transgressions in eastern Ladakh, beginning May 2020, Chinese have not been able to make any gains in terms of ground situation. They have not achieved what is sometimes referred to as salami slicing. So if there is shift, we were able to patrol certain areas, whether in Depsang Plains or Demchok or elsewhere in Galwan Valley, in Gogra Hot Spring, in north and south bank of Pankung Lake. If that is not permitted, clearly ground situation had changed to a disadvantage and to advantage of China. That's the cause of worry.
Now, third, let's come, in fact, to Galwan, Hot Spring, Gogra, and Pangong Lake, which the minister said had buffer zones, which he referred to as steps of a temporary and limited nature. And you ask whether that means many of India's traditional patrolling points are no longer accessible to its troops. And similarly, you ask whether many grazing grounds are no longer accessible to India's grazers. You raise that question. What is your answer? Are those patrolling points no longer accessible? Are those grazing grounds no longer accessible? What's the answer to the question you raise?
I have mentioned in my article that while hard facts are somewhat scarce at this point in time, because government has not shared those details with the public, when we talk to people who are familiar with the ground situation, including recently retired senior military officials, they indicate that the so-called buffer zones, which incidentally is rather unfortunate term and a new term, we had never used this term earlier in our discussions with China, will involve our patrolling to areas our troops visiting earlier being curtailed or prevented, and likewise our graziers will not be able to, or rather they are not being able at present to access their traditional pastures.
Let's
So
just
to
let's
what
just
extent
stop
is
there.
the
Let's
case?
stop there, Mr. Kantha, and make clear to the audience what you're saying. You're saying, and you're relying upon discussions with retired senior military officials who have served in Eastern Ladakh, and those discussions lead to the fact that the existence of buffer zones at Galwan, Hot Spring, Gogra, and Pangong Lake mean that we will not be able to access the points that we earlier were able to access by patrolling. We don't have that reach any longer. And while those buffer zones last, that will be the case.
Yes, we will not be able to access some of the patrolling points. We may not be able to access some of the grazing grounds. To what extent that's the case, I cannot say with any degree of confidence because these facts are not available in public domain.
Absolutely. But you do cite in your article in The Hindu a comment made by Army Chief General Dwivedi after the announcement. And that's very important. It was made after the announcement of disengagement at Depsang and Demchok. And he said, we want to go back to the status quo of April 2020. That was the point he made.
Yes.
And let me finish. The questions you've raised in your Hindu article make clear that at Galwan, Hot Spring, Gogra, and Pangong Lake, we have not gone back to the status quo of 2020. And in Depsang and Demchok, we're simply not sure whether we have or not. So quite clearly, in 4 out of those 6 areas, we haven't gone back to the status quo of 2020, April 2020. And in 2, Depsang and Demchok, we simply don't know whether we have or not because we don't know enough at the moment.
Karan, that statement by the Chief Army Staff I was referring to was made in a lecture I delivered on 23rd October. That is 2 days after disengagement in Depsang and Demchok was announced. And he talks about objective. So clearly, that objective had not been fulfilled or achieved as a result of disengagement package. And we have announced that disengagement is completed. So my understanding is what I indicated earlier, that while there is shortage of dearth of hard facts, we get the feeling that the status quo ante has not been reached. And in fact, Ministry of External Affairs is no longer referring to status quo ante in its statements. If you look
That
at
is another very important point which I want to underline. We would earlier, a couple of years ago, talk about restoration of status quo ante. No longer, as you point out, does the Minister of External Affairs use that phrase anymore.
In his statement in Parliament, Minister didn't use that term. The press statement which came out from the Ministry of External Affairs after the latest meeting at WMCC did not use that term. In fact, we haven't seen that term appearing in any of MEA readouts of late. I understand to some extent restoration of status quo ante in entirety might be difficult because facts have changed on both sides, including in terms of level of patrolling, deployment, and this deployment has become quite entrenched on both sides.
Let me point out something
No,
else.
let me just complete. Let me complete my point. When I refer to restoration status quo ante, and presumably when Army Chief refers to that, what we can arguably, arrive at will be restoration of traditional patrolling rights, restoration of traditional grazing rights.
But even that has not happened as yet.
No, I
Don't
think
go back on what you've said. Don't go back on what you said, but you very clearly agreed that in Galwan, Hot Spring, Gogra, and Pangong Lake, where buffer zones still exist, there are grazing rights and there are patrolling points we cannot access while those buffer zones exist. So as far as those 4 areas are concerned, we have not gone back to April 2020. Full stop. There's no denying it.
No, I'm not going back on anything. In fact, I'm saying that what we need is number one, we should have the creativity on what we agreed upon during our very protracted discussions with China on disengagement. Number one. Number two, the whole idea of buffer zone or steps of temporary and limited nature. I think that should be both temporary and limited. We should dismantle these buffer zones as early as possible. And number three, we should move towards status quo ante in terms of restoration of patrolling rights and restoration of grazing rights as of April 2020 at the earliest. That should be our objective.
I hear what you're saying, Mr. Kantha. We should remove the buffer zones at the earliest. The truth is, we don't know when those buffer zones will be removed. We don't know how long they will last. That is the truth. And the consequence of that truth is while those buffer zones last, we will not have gone back to status quo ante of April 2020. That's the second corollary. While those buffer zones last, we are not going back to April 2020.
But let me also, in all fairness, point out that the minister used the term steps of temporary and limited nature.
But he didn't say how temporary.
Yeah, so that he hasn't said, but
forgive me, I don't mean to interrupt you, but temporary is like a piece of string. We don't know how long that piece of string is. Something can be temporary for 3 years, something can be temporary for 10 years. Remember, this government claimed that Article 370 was temporary and it was only removed 75 years later. So temporary can be a very long time. And I'm citing the government's own example with Article 370.
Well, I don't want to compare Article 370 with what's happening in our discussions with China. But at the same time, for whatever it's worth, as someone who has been involved in these discussions in the past, my recommendation will be that we should move towards dismantling of buffer zones at the earliest. Because
absolutely. Let me raise two other points you make in your Hindu article because I think they are important. You say in your Hindu article, Mr. Jaishankar also said India would not countenance any attempts to change the status quo unilaterally. You're talking about the status quo of the LAC. But then you ask yourself in your Hindu article, has not the status quo along the borders been changed by China since April 2020? And you go on to point out that discussions with retired senior military officials who have served in eastern Ladakh suggest that there is denial of access to several traditional patrolling points under the new arrangements. That means that China has unilaterally changed the status quo. And these discussions you've had with senior military officials who served in Ladakh have established that point for you.
Karan, if we can just step back a little bit and look at what presumably happened, because again, I'm speculating a little bit. We had amassing of troops by China in opposite eastern Ladakh sometime around April 2020. Instead of going back as they do after their routine patrolling, routine exercises, military exercises, they pivoted and they transgressed the line of actual control at multiple locations in eastern Ladakh. We also counter-deployed and did so rather effectively, but Chinese had managed to change the status quo significantly at many areas. To some extent, that has been undone through package which was announced on 21st October, but details are not very clear to us, and also through earlier arrangements relating to Galwan Valley, Gogra Hot Spring, and northern and southern bank of Pankung Lake. But sum total is that there is change in status quo. There's no doubt about it.
Okay, you've confirmed the point. The sum total is that there is change in the status quo done by China. And as you said, there's no doubt about it. You then went on to make a second very important point in your Hindu article, and I want to put that to you now. You said this leads to a deeper concern, which is that the way India and China look at the LAC has changed. Can you spell that deeper concern out for the audience? You're familiar with these issues, the audience isn't. Why would it be a deeper concern if the way India and China look at the LAC has changed? Please spell that out.
Karan, you'll have to bear with me at this point of time because it's LAC, how we look at it, how it has evolved, is rather complex subject. Chinese raised this term way back on 7th November 1959 when Zhou Enlai wrote a letter to Prime Minister Nehru suggesting line of actual control. We didn't accept it. Later, on 15th November 1962, during border conflict, he wrote a letter to leaders of Afro-Asian countries, again reiterating LAC of 7th November 1959, and in fact appending a small map where this LAC of so-called LAC of 7th November 1959 was shown. We didn't accept that. We had a number of reasons. I'll not go into that. But later, when we're trying to work out some framework for management of borders, which led to conclusion of Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement in 1993, we accepted the construct of line of actual control. With clear understanding that we are not referring to any historical alignment like LAC of 7th November 1959. They kept trying to push that in. We rejected that. And we made it clear that it is actual control we are talking about. And second important caveat, which is reflected in all agreements, is that our reference to line of actual control is without prejudice to respective positions of the two countries on the boundary question. The implication being that we are differentiating very clearly between LAC on one side and sovereignty related claims on the other side. But our recent interactions with China suggest that they're often conflating LAC with sovereignty. Like during recent track 2 discussions, they told us that we haven't yet reached our claim line in Western sector, thereby keeping open the possibility that there might be further transgression from their side. This makes us, I think, the need for even greater caution on our part, because under Xi Jinping, sovereignty has become a very major, ingredient in their nationalist agenda.
So
And
what you're saying, Mr. Kantha, is that the Chinese have begun to conflate the line of actual control with the sovereign claim they have over all that territory as well. They see
exactly
the same thing.
Yeah. So, the earlier we had agreed that we'll move towards a common understanding of line of actual control. This is reflected in a formal agreement. We'd agreed to exchange maps, but they have sort of jettisoned the whole process. They're no longer willing to clarify line of actual control.
Which means that there is a big gap in understanding the line of actual control that has now emerged between India and China. They have a different understanding. We have a different understanding.
Karan, on the ground, I must say that both sides have a fairly clear idea of where the LAC lies. There are pockets where
but in terms of sovereignty, there's a different aspect.
Yes, in terms of concept, when you start talking about not losing an inch of territory, that kind of language, then it becomes more aligned with the concept of sovereignty rather than line of actual control, which is more pragmatic.
This also means, does it not, that there could be more transgressions by the Chinese onto what we believe is our side of the border? This is not the last time necessarily. It would happen repeatedly.
We have to be very careful. We have to be cautious. We have to have requisite deterrence to prevent further transgressions. If I were in Government of India in any responsible position, I would have been extremely, vigilant about the risk of transgression by China, not only in Western sector but elsewhere as well, like what they tried to do in Yangtse in December 2022.
Quite right. And in your Hindu article, you raised the question, which is simply not answered either by you or by the government. Have the Chinese been given the right to control in Yangtze or not? We don't know.
We had earlier seen media reports. This was until end September, quoting government sources saying that Chinese are demanding patrolling lights in Yangtse, and these demands are unreasonable and without any basis. But subsequently, after the understanding of 21st October is announced, we had reports in credible media outlets like The Hindu suggesting that there has been some understanding on letting Chinese patrol in the Yangtze area. Now, Yangtze area is a very sensitive area where we are very strongly placed. We have a strong military presence, and we have been able to foil repeated attempts by China to transgress into the area. The last reported case being in December 2022, where we understand that a very large body of PLA troops attempted the transgression, but we managed to push them back. If indeed we have agreed to letting them take some patrolling, that will be, again, change in status quo. If we have not agreed to do that, I think there's need for very clear denial, clarification that there has been no such quid pro quo in terms of letting Chinese undertake patrolling in Yangtze area, and some people even mention Subanseri area in Arunachal Pradesh.
Let me now ask a question that will have begun to occur to the audience as they've heard our discussion. We've talked about multiple instances where lack of clarity from the Indian government, what you call lack of visibility, has created areas of speculation and doubt. Lack of clarity means that we're not sure about how far we can patrol in places like Galwan, Hot Spring, Gogra, and Pangong Lake. The buffer zones are clearly stopping us reaching areas we could previously reach, but there's no clarity about that from our government. Yangtze is another example of precisely the same thing. All of this collectively will have raised a question in the minds of the audience as they hear our discussion, and I want to put that question specifically to you. Is the Indian government hiding something from the Indian people? Or is it at least being less than honest and not telling us the full story? The concerns you've raised, the questions you've asked, raise this question. What's your answer to the question?
Karan, I think I have partly answered your question earlier, that when it comes to sensitive matters, like arrangements for patrolling in border areas by troops of India and China, there is need to share basic information with the public. All details cannot be made public. Sometimes it's counterproductive to do so. Because these are matters, still in discussion.
So when that basic information is not shared to the extent it should be and could be, what does it mean? Does it mean the government is hiding something? Does it mean that at least the government is not telling the full truth?
I will not like to use terms like hiding something or not telling full truth. What I'll say that there is need for full debate, more honest debate in Parliament and elsewhere, as has happened in the past. There have been, multiple cases of transgressions by Chinese onto our side of LAC in the past, but we never shied away from discussion. In this case, unfortunately, there has been no detailed discussion in Parliament since May 2020. This time also, when Minister of External Affairs made his statements in Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. In Rajya Sabha, there's provision for asking, clarifications, but clarification not allowed. I don't think that helps anyone.
You're endorsing the position taken by the opposition and by Congress in particular. You're saying we need, and I'm quoting you, there is need for more honest debate in Parliament. Those were your precise words. I wrote them down.
Yes, actually, but what I have also written in my article, that there is need for more honest debate in Parliament. There's need for government sharing more information with the opposition parties and with public at large. Sometimes,
why do you think the government is not sharing this information?
Can I just complete that? If I can complete that, because that's an important point. it has been done in the past. I've given examples of how during sensitive negotiations, in fact, opposition leaders briefed in advance, even before we signed those agreements.
In
And
one
this was done.
instance, you were the Foreign Service officer who briefed the opposition. You mentioned that in your article yourself.
In two instances, in fact, where I happened to be lead negotiator, agreement on military CBMs of November 1996, an agreement on political parameters and guiding principles of a boundary settlement to April 2005, I was instructed to go and brief opposition leaders in confidence. And this was appreciated by them, and they never breached confidence reposed in them.
Then let me ask you this question. Let me ask you this question. You yourself say that the opposition respected the confidence of the government, they appreciated the briefing, it helped their understanding, and that is the right thing to do in a democracy. The opposition are not enemies, they're only opponents. Now, let me come back. When the government, let me finish my question.
Yeah,
Let me finish my
okay.
question. When the government deliberately chooses not to brief, when it deliberately chooses not to give the full information to the Indian public, and these are deliberate decisions, they're not accidental. What does it mean?
The second part of my argument or suggestion, which I made in the article, is that while there is a responsibility on part of government to take opposition to confidence to the extent possible, to share more with the public, it's equally important that opposition should not try to make.
No, you're not answering my question, and I'm deliberately interrupting you.
Two are
I'm not asking
related.
you about the opposition's duty and responsibility. Let's leave that to the opposition to decide. Neither you nor I are politicians. I'm asking you the question. Sir, you're the person, Mr. Kantha, who pointed out that there is lack of clarity. There is, to use your phrase, lack of visibility. In your article, you pointed out how we clearly don't know how far we can patrol in Demchok and Depsang. We clearly cannot, to the extent we used to earlier in Galwan, Hot Spring, Gogra, and Pangong Lake. And this is not stuff the government has made clear or available to us. So I come back, when a government deliberately, and I'm using that word purposely, when the government deliberately does not give the full story to the Indian people, when it deliberately does not brief, even in confidence, the opposition, what does it mean? Does it not mean they're hiding something? Or at least does it not mean that they are not being fully honest and upfront with the truth?
Well, I will not, like to use, characterization deployed by you about hiding.
Use your own, sir. Use
No,
whatever you want.
my own is something more straightforward. That as a former practitioner, I understand that there are constraints. Not everything can be made public because that comes in the way of taking forward the process of negotiations. But at the same time, there is need to share more, both with opposition, sometimes confidentially, and with the public at large. And what has been done so far in case of Chinese transgressions in eastern Ladakh, I believe, falls short of that.
All right, that is perfectly clear. Let's leave it there. That is a very clear statement. And if I might add, a lot clearer than the Hindu article. And I thank you for that additional clarity. Thank you very much indeed for the time you've given me, Mr. Kantha, and in particular for having made time for me when I know you're busy with a family wedding. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you, Karan.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.